We're building a Hobby King BF109 profile combat plane. Everything's nicely packed, and bagged and taped. It's made of expanded polypropylene. And it's pretty much indestructible anyway, but it seems to have arrived in perfect condition. Fairly simple kit, but I'm going to make a few modifications to it to improve its performance and crash resistance. Instructions. I won't be needing those. First thing we're going to do is strengthen up the carbon spars that are in the body and the wing. They're put in pretty well to start with. I've super glued them in, but from experience I know they tend to pop out when you crash, so it's good to add a little bit of extra strength there. And the way we're going to do that is with some Gorilla Glue or some equivalent. And just a little bit of that on the outside will be enough to strengthen it up. And I mean a little bit, because this stuff expands to 2 or 3 times its size when you've finished gluing it. So just a light coat along the spar. And then to make sure it doesn't bulge up too much, we'll put some regular ordinary masking tape over the top of it. It won't be quite so pretty when we're finished, but it does improve the strength something incredible. The masking tape will peel away from the surface once it's set. Gorilla Glue dries a little bit flexible, so it spreads the load and absorbs shock. And now we'll do the wing. The spars are much more resistant to stretch than they are to compression, and they don't pop out so much, so definite improvement there. And the stiffer wing definitely makes for better flight performance. Okay, I'll leave that for 3 or 4 hours, and depending on the temperature it should be done. So now we're going to take the masking tape off, peel it back, and like I said, it's not a super pretty finish, but it leaves a fairly smooth surface, and it spreads the load around those spars, and they will not be coming out. So there's the body. and it's good and strong. And there's the wing. There's a few rough edges on there, but you can trim those up with a knife. Now I'm going to fit the tail surfaces, and for that I'm going to use this no label Hobby King foam cement. It's kind of halfway between contact cement and Gorilla Glue. It goes on just like contact cement, and you leave it to dry for a little bit and then connect the parts. But it foams up a little bit, so it tends to fill in the gaps between the foam, and it stays a bit soft, so it has some flex that absorbs shock when you crash. Like most contact cement, it works best if you put some on both surfaces before you start. Just spread that out a little bit on the internal surfaces. And it's drying pretty quickly today, so I'll assemble them right now. Leave that to dry for a few hours, and so now I'm going to make the servos for the rudder and elevator. We need to lengthen the leads a little bit to make it long enough for down the body. I'm using Hobby King HXT 500s. They're small, they're light, they're cheap, and they're just bulletproof. I use one of these wire strippers that strips all three cables at once. Strip off just about 1mm off the end of each. Some spare cable from an older servo that I shortened. Okay, so now I'll just tin the surfaces. So I'll put a bit of flux on the wire first. Just dab a little bit of solder on the cables. Not to wet the wire. And I'll separate the wires just enough to allow me to put some insulation back on them and get it far enough away that it doesn't melt them. And then these little clamps are just very useful for soldering together tiny little wires. I'll just slip a little bit of heat shrink tube on this end. clamp it in here. And then the same colour from the servo. Just overlap the wires a little bit, make sure they're touching together. And the trick is to heat from underneath and just dab a bit of solder from above. There, perfect. Swap that insulation over there and just heat it to put it in place. Perfect. There you go, a nice neat join, much less weight than a plug, and it'll survive anything but the worst of crash. Okay, two nicely extended leads. I'm going to fit those into the rudder and elevator. So one's going to go in that slot there. Receiver goes in there, and the other one goes in there, and plenty of room for the receiver. Okay, so now I'm going to fit the wing servos, and I'm using HXT 900s. They're a little bit heavier than the ones for the tail, but these flexible hinges require a bit of effort to move them, and there's a lot of force on those when you're going in a tight turn, so 900s will do the job plenty. Again, they're cheap, they're light, they're very reliable, I found, so ideal for this job. So I'll just put them in about 10 centimeters from the center of the wing. I'm using two servos. They're recommended to use one with single linkage to each wing, but that means you don't get to use flaps, and snap flap is really useful on these planes. It can turn you much tighter than a normal wing, so the extra 9 grams is more than worth it. You just need a 6-channel radio, that's all. So that one will go in there, and this one lined up with that centre beam. The spars is behind that beam, so keep away from that, and otherwise put the servo in the thickest part of the wing. I'll cut these sections out with a model knife. You can make a reasonably tight fit. Just going to glue them in. So that they become part of the structure of the wing. They're cheap servos, so if something goes wrong, we'll just bust them out and put another one in. I'm putting the moving parts on top of the wing to keep it away from the ground when you land, so you don't rip the horns off. Keep those, and I'll put one of them back in the slot where the original servo was to go, to re-strengthen that wing. I'll cut the wings off the servo, there's no need for those. Save a bit of weight and allow it to slide right into the wing. bottom of the wing so that there's nothing sticking out underneath. Yep, that's a good fit. So is that. I'm going to use the Hobby King foam cement again for this. It dries a little bit flexible, and again, anywhere that's going to take some punishment, like the occasional bang from a crash, you want a bit of flexibility. Fit the servos in. I'll do the rudder and elevator. Double check the servos. Alrighty. Cut the wings off. A little bit of glue around the edges. So now I'm going to mark out the positions for the control horns. They're all the same except for the rudder, which has a notch cut in it here. So this one for the aileron, I'll put it so that the pinhole goes at the line of the hinge and the base is in line with the servo, where the end of the servo arm will be. Just mark that up. And the same for this side. Flipped over, of course. There's the hinge line and the same distance. So now let's mark up the rudder. Just line it up with the where the servo arm will be, and that's the one that's got to have the slot in it, so it has to go over the hinge line and just mark up about in the elevator. Again, I'll put it on the top surface so that it is away from the ground when it's landing. And I'll cut the slots for those. Same for the rudder. Cut the slots for the wings. More Hobby King foam glue. And I've got full movement there. And I've got full movement there. So now I'll fit the control rods. Had to arms out to 2mm hole, fit these little connectors. Leave a little bit of room for error. There we go. I'll just put a little dab of Loctite on the end of these so that the bolt won't come undone. But the pin can still rotate inside the plastic. Fit them back on to the servos. Now I'll fit the wing. Again, I'll use the Hobby King foam glue. Sticks EPP foam very well, and it stays a little bit flexible. And this is the joint that takes the most punishment. Bend it a little bit to get it in. And straighten it up. Six and a half. And 6.5. It's square. There we go. So now I'm going to fit the motor. It's Turnigy Aerodrive SK3 2826 1240 kV. I've used these before on this particular model, and it's just the right balance of weight and power. I'm really lucky that'll fit the pre-drilled holes. Important item for these motor mounts is a tiny drop of Loctite on the thread. I have had motors separate company from the aeroplane mid-air, and it doesn't end well. Might just have to drill that out a little bit in there. The motor shaft doesn't run on the foam. Make sure the power cables are coming out where the ESC is going to be. And prop adapter. Again, tiny drop of Loctite on each point. Just just enough to stop the screws coming unwound at an inconvenient moment. We use an 8x4 prop for these. Again, I've tested these before, it seems to be about the right size. These are a clone version of the APC props. Probably not perfect, but since you're liable to crash them and break quite a few, cheap is good. That's good. So there we go, motor installed. So now I'm going to line up all the servos using a Futaba 6EX. It's a pretty simple transmitter. Use a blank model, and I've got a little smart LiPo battery that puts out 5.5 volts, and it's just enough to power the servos. Right, they've all moved into their 0 positions, so now I'm going to have to move those arms. Okay, final battery check. Main flight battery and the ESC installed. Final check of all the servos. The throttle's in the down position. Jitter happening there. So all of those surfaces seem to be roughly square, and of course the throttle's going in the wrong direction, so I have to swap over those motor leads. Perfect. Ailerons are going in the right direction. Rudder is in the wrong direction. Elevator is correct. So I have to reverse the rudder servo. Left, right, left, right. Beautiful. Bit of flex in that tail. So now I'll fit the ESC, and I'll use Hobby King foam glue again, just to strip on the front. And a little on the back where it'll actually contact the foam. Lay those cables roughly where they're going to go. Tack it on there. And leave the glue to dry a little. Okay, it's about ready now. So tack that on. And I'll just put a cable tie in there to hold those cables down. and I'll tack the receiver in place the same way. So here's the final build. I've got a 1000 milliamp hour battery in the front. The ESC is glued on, and the receiver is in place. I've got a video camera mounted on the cockpit so I can video the action, and ailerons, rudder, elevator. I had to put a little bit of carbon strapping on the side because the elevator servo, when it pulls on the tail, it's enough force to bend the rear, so it acted a bit of rudder when worked the elevator, but it's nice and stiff now. And